Donna Arathan.
Donna Arathan.
The most important episode. The Dawn.
We're looking at the life of Donna Arathan. No, we're going to be looking at the book Dawn of Everything.
Well, since we're talking about the origin of society, I have an origin story.
Okay.
Ooh. Does it involve a bang?
Not agriculture, but booze. Because humans figured out how fermentation worked, and they didn't want to leave the fermentation process. So instead of hunter-gathering, they decided to sit there and guard their stash against the other Hobbesian brutes so that they could get drunk by the end of it. And this, of course, leads to the cultivation of barley and hops, fermenting beer and wine, and this is why people decided to settle in one place.
Oh, that's funny.
There's a parallel with elephants. Elephants love getting drunk.
One. I was going to say I've heard this one.
And elephants, for a long time, actually, it was a University of Calgary researcher who figured this out because people thought, no, there's no way elephants could get drunk. They have way too high of a body mass. They would have to, just
drink like a swimming
guzzle
pool.
a barrel, right? But apparently they do not have one of those enzymes required, or one of the enzymes that we have that breaks down alcohol, so they can get drunk despite their massive body size.
So they're easy. They're easy drunks. If you're looking for a date, head to the zoo. Hit up the elephants. They're cheap dates.
But if we're looking for parallels with early primates, elephants travel together. What if they're just traveling from their booze stash to booze stash because they haven't figured out how to cultivate yet?
Yeah, clearly the origins of sedentary society were being just too wasted to move around or waiting for your booze to finish.
It sounds reasonable.
We solved it. The dusk of everything. Here we are.
A literal social lubricant.
Indeed.
And because we can just make things up now, that's what I'm going to make up.
Way into this sort of topic is just like inequality. We talked about inequality last week. That's the topic again in a way. What it is, where it came from, sort of.
I wanted to ask you, Victor, as a political philosopher, this is like what we'd call early modern political philosophy, but it goes back to Plato and perhaps before. But is this the kind of the point when inequality becomes even a concept in political theory, or is there any precursor in Islamic or medieval philosophy?
So that would definitely be a field where I lack knowledge in Islamic. I mean, the thing is, so much of Islamic philosophy was kind of neo-Aristotelianism.
Exemplified by Avicenna.
There was one class that I TA'd for, and I really I can't remember for the life of me the specifics of that. But inequality as a concept, I mean, look, Aristotle worried about it. He just worried about the fact that if you had too much, basically like polarization, then you would lack stability in the regime, right? It's like that, but like inequality was not like seen as a puzzle in the sense of like, why do we have so much of it? More just, well, what are the things that could threaten the stability of a city-state, of a polis? And Aristotle was worried that if you have too much inequality, then you're going to happen. Of course, I mean, I got to say, like, even looking back to Plato, his whole story of how regimes fall, I mean, in some ways, like, it turned out to be quite an accurate account in many ways. I mean, if you could describe the French Revolution as almost being like a case study in like first you have a tyrant or like a tyranny. I forget the exact name that Plato used right back then, and then you have the people like bringing in democracy, which of course Plato saw as chaotic and horrible. And then what's the problem with democracy? It's like then you'll have a strong man who comes in and takes advantage of it and then like becomes leader. Napoleon, right? And it's like, so you can kind of see that pattern happening. And of course the whole, to connect it back to inequality, I mean, Aristotle was just worried about, I think Aristotle and Plato had similar accounts like of regimes with slight modifications, and just worried about the conditions under which they would destabilize. And definitely inequality was something that Aristotle paid attention to in the politics as something that could lead to crisis, which is why the thing that he ultimately advocates for is like this mixed regime, right? Where you have like aspects of democracy and aspects of oligarchy, because then you can have you can maximize basically a middle class. I mean, like he didn't use that language and he wouldn't have known class politics, but ultimately he was like a middle class, middle people is like the translation, are like a stabilizing force.
A middle mob.
Exactly.
What about this claim? I'm jumping ahead, but it pertains to this. What about this claim that it's almost impossible to find, this is a quote, it's almost impossible to find a single European author before the 19th century who suggested that it would be anything other than a terrible form of government, i.e. democracy. As I say, democracy might have been invented in Europe, lest we forget that ancient Greece is in Europe, although they note that much more closely culturally connected to North Africa and the Middle East at the time.
Yep.
So the democracy may have been invented there in whatever, Athens in the 4th, 5th century, but it was considered a horrible idea until the 19th century by almost every single European author. That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's like that doesn't completely go against what Plato and Aristotle think.
I agree that that's true to an extent, but also where that can kind of become a little bit misunderstood from our modern perspective is what they mean by democracy is really different than what we mean by democracy. So from an Athenian perspective, like, so obviously it only includes men and you know, non-slaves,
landowning,
but well, non-slaves. I think, I don't know if land ownership was necessarily, you just had to be a free person and a citizen and a man, but also like the form of democracy, like in terms of the institutions of it. Like today, when we think of democracy, we think about liberal democracy, right? Elections. But if you actually read Aristotle, for him, elections are not actually an aspect of democracy. For him, elections are oligarchy, because you're like using elections to select a few people to rule. So for them, it was like, who are the people who are actually exerting political authority and ruling? Democracy would be like rule of all. So everyone would be exerting direct political authority. And yeah, they thought that was a terrible idea, which is why like ultimately what Aristotle recommends, I would argue, is not that different than liberal democracy. Like he says, you need a mixed regime that has aspects of democracy and aspects of oligarchy. And he said that's the best because it creates a balance. So to some extent, yes, I would say they were against democracy, but in another sense, if to a kind of generalist audience, which I think this book was targeted, I think the way they frame it is slightly misleading, because what they actually thought of as democracy would be not something we would recognize as democracy today. It's something much more radical, where everyone is exerting direct political authority. Every citizen is exerting, or you could at least do a lottery, a sortition, which you, as maybe some of you know from a long time ago, I'm kind of supportive of. That's actually associated with democracy for the ancient Greeks, but certainly not elections.
Yeah, the mob as this cesspool of appetites and reaction and desires. That's the mob is the threat to the stable political order.
Yeah. Which is true, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how do you, this goes into some of the arguments, right? It's like, how can you imagine a direct democracy with countries with so many people in them, right? Like we have a couple examples, like Switzerland and Germany, they preserve a direct democracy element in that you can present a law if you get, say, I think it's in Switzerland, it's like 20,000 signatures or something like that, then you could actually forward a law. It doesn't have to come from whatever, the House, Congress. Like people can get together and propose bills. We don't really have that in North America. All the laws have to sort of be proposed by their elected representatives who form the House of Commons or whatever.
Switzerland is a great example. I like a lot of their institutions. Although interestingly, they didn't give women the vote until the 1970s, and that's probably a consequence of their direct democratic systems, right? Because the men were the only one who could vote, and it took them a really long time to be like, fine, let's give the women the vote.
Yeah, and then, I mean, this question of inequality also kind of runs up against are the forms of equality that we see today inevitable from social progress? That's another. I think that's another.
By the way, have we even said what we've read yet? Have we even told the audience? I mean, I guess it'll be in the title.
I think, yeah. Well, Wengrow and Graeber's book, The Dawn of Everything, published a couple years ago.
The Davids.
I'll
be calling them at least.
The Davids. They published this book, and I already mentioned one of their questions, like the origin of inequality as a discourse, in a way, when it becomes so important in the 18th and 19th century. And as I mentioned, they claim that before then, democracy, which we maybe shouldn't conflate with equality, was looked at as a bad form of government until the 19th century, after many years of discussing these ideas. But then their other question is then the forms of inequality we see today, based on some ways of approaching history. Some people would claim that these are, necessary forms. These are sacrifices that have to be made in order to have, a functioning society with so many people in them, where you need centralized forms of government, you need authority, you need bureaucracy. Otherwise, everything would fall apart. And unfortunately, some of the consequences of having this are, some people are going to be unhoused. Some people are going to be at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak. And their challenge is to say, can we imagine another form of society, right? Like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But it appears we are at a moment in time where we do need to make changes. And they go back really far to demonstrate that these forms of social inequality are not necessary, that in fact they are, part of a dynamic and experimental social development that kind of got stuck at some point in history. We kind of got stuck. And part of our stuckness is the way we look back and see our own progress. And then the lenses are Rousseau and Hobbes largely for that.
So I understand they're kind of poking holes in the sort of standard story, some of which I found really interesting and convincing. Other things I think are based on a slight misreading of certain things that I'm less sure about. But I don't know what the argument is. So I don't know if that because you were kind of talking there and made it sound like you knew what the argument was. So maybe I missed it in the introduction.
I think what I was just saying, and then we'll go. I think what I was just saying really was that they're trying to open this question up. I think that's their goal.
Okay, so there's not actually an argument for why we don't need, let's say, any hierarchical structures. Because I was looking for that argument, but it seems to be just implicit between the lines, and I was like, well, maybe it comes later in the book. It probably does.
They're questioning the idea about why people are claiming that we do need those structures. That's what they're attacking. They're not saying that hierarchy is unnecessary or always bad. They're just saying, why do some people think it's completely and utterly necessary and inevitable, and that hierarchy goes along with inequality and social stratification? They're saying those unequal social arrangements are something that we've just kind of written off in a way, right? We write off inequality as a necessary sacrifice to maintain, our current social organization, which is necessary and inevitable based on social history, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sorry, Pills, what were you saying?
I wanted to just rehash what the common story is. And when I was reading this came to mind. When I was in 6th grade, how old are you in 6th grade? 11, something like that?
11 or 12.
I think 11
I think it's
12,
plus
11.
5 or 6 years usually.
We had this little history textbook with a bunch of pictures, and one of the assignments, which I remember vividly, was we had to make a comic strip. It had 6 frames, 6 stages, and the first one was hunter-gatherers. So we had to draw hunter-gatherers, and then they stripped the bark off trees and started burning forests, I guess. And then stage 3 was agriculture. I can't remember the last 3. But this is the common story, is for 100,000 years, nothing happened. Then all of a sudden you have agriculture, and then you have Sumer and Egypt and these giant settlements that produce, grain. Because there's grain, It allows you to have an upper class or a priestly class. Religion is produced. And this is kind of the stageific narrative. And despite this not having a whole lot of empirical evidence to support it anymore, or a lot more evidence that doesn't fit into this 6-stage story of how we arrived at the present, most people believe it. And then Steven Pinker, that adrenochrome sucking vampire, but people like Steven Pinker just rehash this narrative. They brought up in this chapter, of course, capitalist apologists rehash this narrative as like the most natural thing in the world is to produce a market, right? And to have turn to money and to have trade, and then civilization grows out of these nodes of trade with hierarchy, with priests, with kings, and so on.
Classic political economy beliefs.
Classic political economy beliefs. So this is just the main story, and they want to say we could, if we actually looked at the evidence, and there's a bunch of new evidence apparently in their fields. One's an archaeologist, the other's an anthropologist?
Anthropologist.
Yeah.
So if we looked at the evidence, then we would see, no, they were actually experimenting. They tried different things. These supposedly independent nomadic hunter-gatherer bands like met up for these giant cultural events in certain places. So basically, it's a myth busting. Our picture of it is wrong.
And what I liked about it too is the way they also talk about how, because in that traditional story, it's like, oh, when we were hunter-gatherer bands, that's when we had egalitarianism. That's when we were equal in small groups. And what I like about what they say is like, that's not, first, A, that might not be the only formation where that's possible, but also B, a lot of hunter-gatherers probably weren't egalitarian either, right? So they kind of like are like, stop over-romanticizing and under-romanticizing kind of like the past, like sort of both sides are kind of making a mistake. I also liked the way that they talked about the kind of cherry picking of particularly violent examples of tribes, right? That like some try to make an argument for how the state of nature is some kind of really violent place. And that also reminded me of, I remember a long time ago reading this book, The Sex at Dawn, which was about like the prehistoric origins of human sexuality. And that book I think has gotten a lot of criticism later, but one of the things like I really liked about it is they did something sort of similar rhetorically where they're like, look at this standard story that pushes monogamy, and they kind of like offer this different evidence. But one of the things they point out is like a lot of people like to talk about chimpanzees, and I've seen Jordan Peterson fucking do this like not even that long ago, like talk about chimpanzees to like look at their violent tendencies and their kind of like territorial tendencies. But there's also fucking bonobos who we're just as related to, right? And they have a totally different social structure. They are like all about free love and like have sex with each other and don't really like have much conflict. And they're actually the only other primate that actually has missionary sex, which is really weird.
Thank you for that.
It's super weird. It's super weird. I've seen pictures. It's like very bizarre. Like they're basically like pygmy chimps. And anyway, so like it just reminds me of how like we always hear stories about like the violent tribes, or like we only hear stories of like the violent chimpanzees, but it's like this other side, the bonobos, no one talks about, but they tell you a different story about human nature if you want to. But what I would also say, by the way, is just using chimpanzees or bonobos or even tribes to try to generalize about human beings is, I mean, tribes makes more sense, but like especially applies to chimpanzees or bonobos. Like I don't think you can make any conclusions about human beings by looking at them at all. Right. So that's also just stupid.
Another thing we do is use like uncontacted, uncivilized tribes that still exist today as examples,
as like time capsules
of our ancestors. So basically they're just saying, you know, whatever you think, you're thinking of in cardboard cutouts. And everything you say about it, you can complicate it. But they say at one point, anything you can imagine about how different our cultures are today, it's the same then. We're all modern humans, even 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, I think they mentioned that even like our brain structures haven't really, like in evolutionary terms, our brain structures haven't changed for many, many thousands of years. And so, you know, those prehistoric people who we call primitive are us. They have the same brain, the same anatomy. They just have a different situation, obviously. But their mental life, their intelligence, they're just as capable as modern people. Like they're the same. but just in a radically different context.
They have an
They're
imaginary...
not innocent children, as some people like to call them.
They have an imaginary full of myths that they self-justify, and they probably have true believers who believe in their random mythology, people who don't believe as much, but we have all of our modern mythologies if you've seen any of my content.
Also,
but
quick.
I wanted to set this up.
I was just going to say quick little aside, like which I just listened to. So I think a bit later in the book, they also talk about how really, really early humans, if you look at the archaeological evidence, were coexisting with a bunch of other human species. And I thought it was like, I never thought of it this way, but they were like it would have looked a lot similar to like what you see in Middle Earth, like in the sense that you'd see like dwarves, like giants, just like really different human species. And you can even find archaeological evidence of like basically modern-ish humans like coexisting with these pygmy, like other like Homo sapien style, like smaller brained, and it would have been a totally different world and social structure to have like multiple human species.
Middle Earth, Neanderthals, right?
Yeah, well, Neanderthals, but also other ones, and it's just really interesting to think about a world where you have multiple sentient human species coexisting, and it would be more like a fantasy world of like dwarves and elves and like whatever, like coexisting kind of different human species. I never thought of it with that kind of analogy before, but anyway.
It's really hard to even picture this, to put the concepts into images. Like the fact that blew my mind a little bit was there's this cave in Spain, we've probably seen it, where they have the animals and the handprints painted on the wall. And these paintings were done like 10,000 years apart. So you're doing
25,000 to like 10,000 BC or something.
Yeah, you're doing the same thing. You have a similar or relatable social structure and similar or relatable rituals to your ancestors 10,000 years prior, which as moderns, it's impossible, or at least for me, it's impossible to conceive of a time scale that's that relatable in terms of the past to the present.
And it really, I think, what our future generations are going to have to even grapple with too is that it's even impossible now to perform an isolated act. Like literally anything you do is going to be broadcast to the corners of the earth immediately, right? Like look at these people painting for 10,000 years. Someone else on the other side of the planet, no fucking idea what they're doing. They are not building on their style. They're not creating an artistic tradition. It's local. Right? So we have this globalization to deal with, which is, I mean, even in the whole 20th century, it's very difficult to get out of that mind frame and look at this stuff in its local specificity, but also taking into account movement and displacement, but in a non-globalized context where information doesn't travel like viruses and beams at the speed of light.
So I came to this book with a really open mind. I'd heard about it, heard some of the summary, but we got to get into
We'd been planning to look at it for a while.
We got to get into the division that they set up, which is there's two options that are not them, but two options to look at this period, which is the Hobbesian and the Rousseauian, and then suddenly they're on our turf. So I don't know what you guys are going to say about it, but I came to this so hoping that I would just be like, yes, this is an artistic, imaginative, new painting of the past, but I get stuck on these details. So I had a big problem with how they handled Rousseau, considering we read Rousseau last week, so it was fresh in my mind. I don't know if Hobbes, you could object similarly.
I had some issues with their Hobbes reading too, but anyway, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, but I hate that. I didn't want to read like that. I don't want to think like that, but you know, training is hard to overcome. Yeah, so covering Rousseau last week, for example, I find it kind of funny that they chose him as this foil, say nothing really positive or defensive except here and there. But the purpose of their book in general is so incredibly Rousseauian. It couldn't be more Rousseauian if they had read more than just one chapter of one discourse that he submitted for an essay contest. So when it comes to, like they say in the beginning, basically as a thesis statement, we need to have a new political imagination. We need to expand the imagination. And they said, here's a direct quote, in the end, we decided to write a book that would echo, to some degree at least, that evolution in our own thought, in those conversations. The real breakthrough moment came when we decided to move away from European thinkers like Rousseau entirely. But they basically then quote Rousseau, not the Discourse of Inequality, but a book like A Meal, perhaps, when they say, what if we treat people from the beginning as imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures who deserve to be understood as such? What if, instead of telling a story about how our species fell from an idyllic state of equality, we ask how we came to be trapped in such tight conceptual shackles that we can no longer even imagine the possibility of reinventing ourselves? So all of this language, reinventing yourself, having a new imagination, freedom, creativity, this is practically a direct quotation of something Rousseau would have said, including in The Origin of Inequality and A Meal. This is a combo that the modern human is not just this rational, scientifically obsessed animal, but one who desires freedom, one whose happiness comes from imagination and creativity. So this is why I thought, you can't just shit on Rousseau your entire book when your thesis statement could be taken from the book that you're shitting on.
Yeah, I mean,
that's exactly what Rousseau is kind of saying in the sense that we have this initial freedom, and in order to preserve that freedom, we run headlong into our chains, which is to say, government and bureaucracy and sort of extra personal social organizations that don't involve face-to-face relationships so much as controls and rules and things like that. And yeah, so it sounds like that they're kind of reproducing that. Like, what if instead of saying how it fell from some kind of Eden, right? Like that's what they want to get rid of the Eden side, right? Because Rousseau's story is uncannily close to a Garden of Eden, right? Where you live in this perfect world and then original sin befalls you and then suddenly you're out roving like hunter-gatherers until a second tragedy hits, which is agriculture. Or in someone like Pinker's in a more Hobbesian vein, it's the city-state. The city emerges as the locus of inequality, right? Where you have bureaucracies. Like there's two sides to this. Like that's the general development, right? From tribes to bands to chiefdoms and to like city bureaucracies and kingships and things like that, where we have this linear story. And they're trying to get rid of that, but almost preserve that innocence that Rousseau was talking about, that sort of creative, passionate exuberance for social experimentation. They're trying to preserve that without saying that it necessarily implies moving into forms of hierarchy and dominance, right? Like Rousseau's story is that, like a lot of people repeating Rousseau's story, like Jared Diamond and Francis Fukuyama, say, yeah, that state was great. That state of nature, we live in these little bands. It's all egalitarian, but come on, grow up, be real. Be real, man. Be a man. We need leadership. We need hierarchy. We need a chain of command, and big populations need chains of command. So these things are necessary evils. And then from the Hobbesian point of view, these things are actually preventing the state of war that everybody seems to kind of revert to. If society kind of lapses, we revert back into a state of nature where it's bellum omni, the war of all against all kind of thing.
So Victor, you've read Hobbes recently. Is there reading of Hobbes similar to that? I mean, of course, when you're writing a book, you need to set up foils. It's just a little bit like, you know what? It's a little bit too much of a foil, because you could have read the rest of the discourse, and you would see clearly that Rousseau says, agriculture came to the aid of these other arts that were being developed. Agriculture did not come first, actually.
Yeah. I think Hobbes is, I think it's okay. I also felt that, look, they need a foil. They're kind of giving a generalized understanding of both of them. I think with Hobbes, there's just a couple things where I was like, I don't know. Like, I think that but this is a common misunderstanding. I think like the emphasis on a war of all against all, like this is not really, I think what's often overemphasized in a Hobbesian account is like selfishness, self-interest, and like aggression, war of all against all. When really I would say like the central thing, and I was actually listening carefully for it, and I don't think they said it, but Hobbes, and he even says this, I mean, the main motivating feature, it's not exactly selfishness, but fear. Like, it's like literally like you're afraid. And I think that makes a difference in your interpretation. And it's like when there's no structure to secure your safety and well-being, then you're going to be motivated by fear. And the reason it's described as a war of all against all is because even if you make an agreement with someone, right, that's why where he talks about, compact and all this stuff in Leviathan. And it's like, it's just the fact you have no certainty that someone's not just going to backstab you the next day. And that makes it kind of a psychological war of all against all, because you're just never sure. There's nothing to guarantee that person isn't going to eventually backstab you. Even though, interestingly, Hobbes does say in The State of Nature, like most will be cooperative and most should be cooperative. But the problem is that you never know. And because we're so motivated by fear, so I think like it's okay. I understand you take the nasty, brutish short quotes and you take the war of all against all quote. And like, I get that. This is a common misunderstanding by non-theorists outside of political theory to describe it that way. But when you actually look at what he's saying, it's a little bit more nuanced, but I want to be forgiving for that. And I do think that the more nuanced argument is a little bit more convincing. It's a little bit more interesting because I think there is something to that. To the idea of fear, like when you don't have any structure, like that makes way more sense to me than, oh, human beings are selfish, therefore they're going to be aggressive against each other. That's a really different story than just we're all afraid. And interestingly, the other thing that in Hobbes that makes him similar to Rousseau is he also thinks that people are equal in the state of nature, right? And but they're equal in their equal ability to kill you, right? Like even women, right? Because we're smart and we all have the equal ability to outsmart each other, and there's always an equal potential to be outsmarted by somebody. So obviously very different account of equality, but I thought it's also worth mentioning that to some extent Hobbes also agrees that there was equality in the state of nature, just not in the same way that Rousseau thought that there was equality.
That really changes the interpretation of Hobbes from nasty, brutish, and short, like you're going to be literally killed. Instead, it's more like you might get killed,
scared.
Probably not, but your biggest fear is the guy that you're making a contract with is going to break the contract. So that's why you need a Leviathan.
And there's no recourse. Exactly. And then there's no recourse.
So you need a legal system to protect that contract kind of thing. You need an impersonal system of rule. But like the point is for Hobbes, those impersonal systems of rule are curbing our natural selfishness, right? I don't think the state of nature ceases to exist, right? Like it's, again, for Hobbes, I think in here they mention he almost suggests this is literal human history, but not quite. He's still sort of on the side of this is a thought experiment.
He hedges, yeah.
And so he thinks humans, like I've seen readings of Hobbes saying, he believes humans are naturally selfish, and without these, governmental mechanisms, those tendencies would tend to come to the fore. So there's your sort of liberal theory where legal systems are meant to, mediate conflicts between people, right? As opposed to the Rousseauian view where those things are more like repressive, right? Like almost in the way Freud kind of rereads this story, is that so entering into civilization is necessarily entering into a form of repression, where your sort of natural innocence and these sorts of hunter-gatherer egalitarian tendencies then get kind of redirected into hierarchies. And again, this is necessary in order to live together in big societies, but it has the opposite effect. Instead of curbing a state of nature in which, the selfishness dominates, it's curbing a state of nature in which, sort of an egalitarian freedom is nice and it's great, but it prevents us from achieving these larger social organizations. So that, again, for Rousseau, agriculture kind of does this. It forces us to come together and stay together and make organizations and creates private property. And then for more Hobbes influenced kind of view, it's the city, right? The city, the centralized government, the bureaucracy, that's the origin of inequality. And what they're saying is that's not true in either sense, right? Before, in the egalitarian social small societies, right? Hunter-gatherers, we can find both egalitarian and inegalitarian hunter-gatherers. Snap forward to the city. We can find both egalitarian and inegalitarian social organizations of cities. Go to agriculture. We can find agriculture becoming a permanent thing. We can find agriculture being sort of just a sporadic, temporary thing. We can find people who dabble with agriculture and then fucking reject it entirely and go back to hunting and gathering again. He says that they say that the problem is with the linearity of all of these stories. They're linear. They assume there's stages. There's many different versions of stage theory, and they say this is just not the right way to look at history. And so the Hobbes-Rousseau choice is not, you could blend their decisions together and make a really nuanced theory. But they're saying, like, first of all, the fact that they got it right with a guess hundreds of years ago and that we can't improve on those guesses is a ridiculous idea. And second of all, the either or between them is a false binary. You can't look at it as either one or the other, egalitarian before, inegalitarian after, or vice versa. You cannot do that. That is not what the evidence, like, that doesn't fit. There'll always be large swaths of evidence that don't fit either of those stories. And so what do? We got to tell a completely different fucking story. Get rid of the Garden of Eden, get rid of this, the John Wick kind of war against all, and we just got to retell this story. And what their problem is, we haven't come up with a new story that's super memorable, right? Like bands, tribes, chieftains, agriculture, cities. That's very easy and memorable. But we haven't come up with anything better to put in that place, so people still go back to this story. Even though the archaeologists working today, the experts in the field, actually have kind of privileged access to this new data that controverts these stories. But it's very difficult. That's the effort they're trying to do now, is write this popular book, get these ideas out there. And they've been accused exactly of cherry picking. But what you were saying before, they actually say, here's what we can do with cherry picking. You know, Francis Fukuyama or Steven Pinker says this. Okay, let's cherry pick a different story instead and go back. Here's a dwarf buried in a lavish burial. What does that show us? That shows us that ancient societies were caring. They were based on care. If people were suffering, they would do stuff for them. So see how cherry picking, if you just generalize from cherry picking, you'll get all kinds of these fun stories. But they will be wrong because you're just ignoring other pieces of evidence that controvert it. I mean, it's the complexity of the history that's the problem, and the simplifications of Rousseau and Hobbes. Not them specifically, because it is a misreading of them to look at them as talking about literal world history, but those stories have kind of been literalized and taken up, whether it's by Steven Pinker or Jared Diamond or Francis Fukuyama or any of the other examples they give.
Oh, by the way, Rousseau just straight up says, I have no idea how this happened. It's like, we didn't have metal, and we didn't. He keeps talking about corn. Doesn't corn come from the Americas?
The New World, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So he keeps talking about, like, no, corn grows better in Europe. I'm like, dude, he doesn't know shit, but he also says, yo, I don't know shit. All I know is we didn't have any of this stuff, and then we got it. So I don't know. I'm being a little bit defensive of the philosopher here, but
later in the dawn of everything, it's funny, they actually add some extra detail to like the whole process. I don't know if you guys got to that point of like Rousseau actually entering the contest and writing that essay, and I didn't know. I think I maybe said something wrong in our last episode because I thought he came second, but he was actually disqualified.
Oh shit! Really?
Because he went over the word count. Like in the and like he was a little too and it's funny, the guy who actually won the discourse of inequality like contest made like a really stupid religious comment, like argument about why how like how original sin is the origin of inequality.
Yes, classic.
So I don't know how much is if this is just quibbling, like, but do you combat an oversimplification with another oversimplification? No, we should be.
No, I mean, it's
we
not
should
clear.
be focusing on the real enemy here, which is of course Steven Pinker, this asshole. Steven Pinker's like, we live in heaven already. Why are you even trying to do anything? Taking money from Peter Thiel, but he completely misrepresents, obviously, how did we get here? Europe spread civilization everywhere, and now everywhere from China to indigenous people in North America, everyone lives better because we have working toilets. And you go, yeah, okay, sure. Did civilization spread from Europe? In a sense, that's acceptable. But it did so, of course, through enslavement, exploitation, genocide, by annihilating entire civilizations. And they had, some legal squabbles about should we annihilate this civilization or should we not? Cortez didn't give a fuck. Cortez was like, if I read to you from the top of a hill, infidels, please convert to Jesus Christ, then you're allowed to kill them after that happens. So anyway, this is the Steven Pinker story is, we have all the comforts of modern life, everything that anyone could want. But of course, Steven Pinker never addresses the question of happiness. I haven't read Steven Pinker lately, but according to them, he never talks about the question of happiness. And he cherry picks these examples of how awful it was before. There was tribes doing human sacrifice and ritual battle where the winner would be right. How awful is this? And I was thinking, in terms of this, if you look back at our civilization, if an alien anthropologist digs up the records of the United States and watches our news, then they'd be like, these people are insane. Shooters go into nurseries and schools and just massacre children weekly. These people are absolutely barbaric. So if you're going to cherry pick, I'm saying to cherry pick examples of human sacrifice within a context. If you look at us, we're not doing all that much better if you choose to focus on the most uncivilized acts.
Yeah, the Pinker is one of the examples of the Hobbes influenced theorist, where he sees cities as the transition, not farming. But yeah, the claim is, as Wengrow and Graeber write, what follows is, to put it bluntly, a modern psychologist making it up as he goes. So he ain't got shit. This is what the cherry picking comes from. Otzi. Remember the Iceman? I mean, this happened in the early 90s. Otzi, the ice guy, kind of came up. He was found, frozen with an arrow in his side. And then Steven Pinker is just like, how come they couldn't leave us a corpse without resorting to foul play? And he cites Otzi being shot by an arrow. And then they say, okay, let's cherry pick. That's cherry picking. Let's cherry pick Romito too. There's a 10,000-year-old burial of a male with a rare genetic disorder, dwarfism, a severe type of dwarfism, which would have rendered him kind of one of the people who couldn't contribute to, the community. Instead, we see an extraordinarily lavish burial for this person. The point is, the realities of early human social life are far more complex, this is a quote again, and a good deal more interesting than any modern state of nature theorist would ever be likely to guess. We're not suggesting we should, generalize from this now other cherry-picked case. We say it's just, look how easy it is. You just look at a violent burial and say, state of nature was violent. And then we look at another one. State of nature was egalitarian and based on care and mutual respect. Hobbes and Rousseau again. But it's this false binary that we tend. It's the Procrustean bed that we force our human histories into that fuck them up. But we need some kind of bed. We need to put this shit to bed somehow. But the evidence is still rolling in. The techniques are improving. What do we do right now? We don't do anything. We just have to say those are wrong. Let's stay and wait. Then we can decide what we should build a society like on Mars or whatever, wherever we go colonize. Then we can tell Elon Musk how a society should be developed when he finally gets out there.
Another example that I didn't know about that they brought up is if you want to go with this story, then how do you explain, and they say you can't draw too many conclusions from this, but there's all these stories of, civilized Westerners who were either adopted because they got lost or kidnapped by these tribes, and then even given the option to return to quote unquote civilization, they're like, no, it's better here. I'm gonna stay.
Yeah, this was another thing they were talking about, and that Pinker cited was this Yanomami girl who got taken, and raised. What was it as
This was in Brazil. It was in Brazil, I think.
Yeah, he cites this story. Yeah, she gets abducted and lives with a series of Yanomami families and marries and actually becomes like a kind of important member in the community. In 1956, she abandoned the Yanomami to go back to her natal family, a Western family, only to find herself in, quote, a state of occasional hunger and constant dejection and loneliness, and after a while made a fully informed decision to go back to the Yanomami and return to live with them for the rest of their life. The point of this sort of pursuit of happiness section is that people are happier with the natives than they are with the either way, right? The natives abduct a white person. Somehow that white person is returned to their white family. They don't like it. They go back and live with the natives. Same thing the other direction. White people abduct a young native, raise them. Eventually they leave because fuck the Europeans. Like that's basically they're saying the happiness at this time seemed to be on the side of the people who were critical of the Europeans, not the Europeans themselves. That's what they seem to be saying about this happiness section, that people are finding more happiness among the peoples of...
Yeah, I mean, I found those interesting. I felt like it was like rhetorically doing maybe a bit too much work for my taste, but maybe I'm being a little bit nitpicky because, they spend a lot of time criticizing Pinker and all these others for cherry picking, and then they find like ancient sources that show a handful of examples of like, some Europeans not wanting to move back.
To be fair, they say we're not building an argument off this point, but if we were to do what Pinker's doing, we could come to the exact opposite conclusion.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the cherry picking thing, right? Because where Pinker he cherry picked even within a piece of evidence. Like he stopped the story at brutality, and then he said if Pinker continued the story, she might have diagnosed her with Stockholm syndrome because she went back to the brutality at the end, right? She chose the quote unquote brutality over quote unquote civilization. So he might just conclude that she had brain damage or something.
No, I mean I'm no fan of Pinker's argument here at all. So
I think he's just saying like stopping it where he does and the evidence he chooses. Like this is like Pinker's telling very Peterson-like stories with this kind of. But they get it. I've read some of the reviews of this book, and that's exactly the charge. They're cherry picking evidence. They're being unfair. They're overgeneralizing. They're this. They're that. They're whatever Graeber and Wengrow are doing that the critics don't like. But that seems to be the fucking point. Is to say, cherry picking can produce all these narratives. The original sin fall from Eden story, whatever. We're fitting the evidence into these narratives when these are the wrong narratives to be fitting the evidence into in the first place.
And if we're doing a narrative that we're taught when we're 12, I'm partial to cherry picked examples just to tell a different story for the sake of it, even.
Totally.
Not to build the narrative out of the stories, but to just show why Pinker stopped short and cherry picked, like in both of his chosen pieces of evidence.
I like I said, I've been enjoying the book quite a lot, and I like the idea of just giving another account of history. I actually did also read when I was on a trip. I think I was on my way to Europe. And I had the audiobook for the Francis Fukuyama book, actually, whatever it is, like the origins of political order, or whatever. And look, I mean, I learned a lot from that book. I don't like he goes through a lot of different stuff. So like, I don't know if I would put him in the same camp as Steven Pinker, because like Fukuyama goes into a lot of detail and seems to, I mean, give a lot of nuance from what I understand. He also doesn't just focus on North America. I mean, he goes back to, the thing I learned most about was just like Chinese administration. Like I had no idea how sophisticated like 3000 BC China was in their administrative and bureaucratic like organization. But anyway, so like I like these stories in general, and it's good to have another story that comes in and says, well, look, there's this other evidence that kind of shows that maybe these different kinds of things are possible. What I felt like unclear about, and again, I mean, first, I need to finish the book, and maybe this book just isn't that. But I know that a lot of anarchists are excited about it, and like because apparently there's some kind of implicit argument here, but I'm not sure like what that argument is, and maybe there's not that argument that this is showing. Like, I guess the only argument is more like a negative one, that we shouldn't think that only one form of organization is possible. And okay, and in response to that, I would say like I'm not really sure that serious thinkers really believe that only one possibility, like that only one thing is possible. Like I don't think that people, I think there is a lot of acknowledgement of different social structures existing. Like even before I read any of this stuff, like my understanding was that was not really that controversial of a claim. Like there are other kinds of social organizations that have existed. Now,
we also have to consider our sort of access to this information is much higher because we are in academia.
Yes, totally. But then the thing that I wonder about is, because they do tease a little bit, the Davids, they tease a little bit and they say, oh, like, maybe we don't need, any social, like maybe we don't need any overarching authority. But then they kind of go back and they'll be like, well, of course, we're not saying that these Indigenous people didn't have laws, right? They're like, they acknowledge they did have laws. They were just enforced through different kind of collective mechanisms. So that's where obviously like kind of my political science, political theory hat, I get curious because I'm like, okay, well, what are you actually talking about? Like, what do you mean by political authority? What do you mean by hierarchy? Because it seems to me that to say some social organizations don't have hierarchy, I'm looking forward to seeing if they actually come up with an example, because I don't exactly know what that would mean, right? Like, I actually do think that the basic Hobbesian question or dilemma applies. Like, it seems like a real argument, which is, like, I think the reason why you would even join a tribe is for Hobbesian reasons, because you're afraid to not belong to something that can give you some guarantee and protection that when you make agreements and you cooperate with people, you're going to be protected. Like at its most basic level, right? Like, not that you need a sovereign, right? But like you need some structure that is going to protect you.
You're a little bit projecting the Hobbesian social contract onto those conditions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure.
You don't think of yourself as a sovereign individual with the choice to either leave or stay. You're born there.
Oh, of course. I mean, no one does though. Like literally no one does. Like no matter what the social organization is.
I mean, like one of their forms of freedom is the freedom to move.
But the point that I'm making is that that argument for why you want to stay within an organization is an argument for that social organization, whatever it is, its legitimacy, right? So its legitimacy is because it's able to protect you, right? And I think that applies.
I think even more importantly is how do you keep not your life, but your contracts? Because this is always a problem.
But in political theory of legitimacy, like political legitimacy is one of the biggest questions in political theory, like what it means. And I would say that like that's like Hobbes's point is a question of legitimacy, right? And for him, the most important thing is that whatever the social organization, yes, he obviously advocates for like a crazy one, is insofar as it can protect you and protect contracts and agreements.
Yeah, I noticed that the major difference between Hobbes and Locke was that Hobbes says the sovereign must have the will of the people behind it, but the people can't depose the sovereign. Locke brought in the idea that if the sovereign is not serving the will of the people, the sovereign can be deposed. Hobbes is not willing to go that far.
I mean,
but
setting
the will
aside
of the people was there. Legitimacy, i.e., was there. Yeah, of course.
But like my point is actually that for Hobbes, legitimacy doesn't need the people, and what I'm saying, like, it just needs that you feel safe. like it's like it doesn't matter whether or not like people actually accepted it, right? Just like that's why you're born into some tribe or band. It doesn't matter that you didn't choose it. It's legitimate insofar as it can protect you and keep you safe.
And one of the very interesting arguments about Hobbes' way it's been interpreted, here's a quote. Some suspect that Hobbes' state of war was really an allegory for his native England's descent into civil war when they were
definitely
end quote. You know, when they were involved in what was it, like the 30-year war? Was that the war? I don't remember which war it was.
The English Civil War started at the very tail end of the 30 Years' War, which also featured a quarter of Europe or something died in that war. So if you want a war of all against all, where no one is keeping their contracts, you need to look no further than what Hobbes was living through.
Exactly.
Like Hobbes's point is like we all tend to. They make this fun argument here too. So Hobbes came close to suggesting that this state really existed when, quote, here's a quote again, when he noted how the only people who weren't under the ultimate authority of some king were the kings themselves, and they seem to be constantly at war with one another, right? So if you're not under that authority, you're kind of in the state of nature. I guess kings are in it in the sense that they are their own authorities, so they answer to nobody. I guess maybe
that's exactly
someone like Bosway would say they answer to God. That's divine right, but
that is precisely the argument that IR realists make in international relations theory, right? That's what they say. That's why they like Hobbes, because they're like, nation states don't have anything above them, right? So nation states are in the state of nature.
And that's why Trump must be prosecuted. Otherwise, we're in a state of nature again because he's above the law. And you know, what's the special thing about presidents against kings? Presidents are not above the law.
Well,
right?
Well,
I mean, formally, in theory, okay. You can
they are. They are subject to the Constitution. They're below in America.
Certainly act in a way in which they are above the law, in many ways. But sure, yeah, like the state of nature is for Hobbes is a war against all, okay, and then society curbs that. For Rousseau, society is a tragedy. It takes us out of our nice egalitarian state of nature, but it is inevitable. That is why you have Jared Diamond and Francis Fukuyama on the they're on one side of the argument.
I don't agree with you on this, though. This is like...
Not according to me, it's according to them.
Telling, like, Rousseau, the whole point of this, again, I'm returning to defending my boy. Again, the point of the state of nature is not that this is a linear narrative of history. The point is that Locke and Hobbes are over across the water there saying... Science, reason, civility, we get better forever. Let's banish all metaphor from political speak because we need to be clear and we need to do science and we need to be rational forever and ever, and we get better. Whereas Rousseau is responding to that, not coming out of nowhere, but responding to that saying, this is not normal, the shit that you're saying. Humans need imagination. They need creativity. They need some sense of purpose and community to be happy. So the thing you're saying is wrong. So just to be like, oh, we have two options for world history, it's not really what the debate was even about.
But aren't they in a way saying, yeah, Diamond and Fukuyama are misinterpreting Rousseau? They make it clear Rousseau was engaged in a thought experiment. But like here, the classic story, right? Fukuyama, Diamond, was the invention of agriculture. And this is a quote again, the higher population levels it sustained, agriculture brought about a transition from bands to tribes, accumulation of food surplus. This is also actually the Marx and Engels make this argument too. The accumulation of food surplus well, here's their quote anyway, fed population growth, leading some tribes to become chieftains. And some other people will say, agriculture is the origin of private property, right? And private property is the source of inequality. And, the Marx and Engels sort of argument is right, like these places create a stock or a hoard, and there's a surplus. And then as soon as you have a surplus, you enable the division of classes. Either way, they're wrong. That's the claim here. Both narratives are wrong. I mean, it's probably more of a mixture of both with more back and forth and dynamism and experimentation. That seems to be the main point, right? It's not a linear narrative either way. It's a messy, experimental, back and forth where some people go forward to agriculture, some people go backwards, some people go back and forth. Some people even do it within a yearly cycle as they go back and forth between different social forms. The point of the whole thing is today, for the anarchists, we seem to just think of our society as just the necessary outcome of human history, and that nothing can fucking change, even though we have, again, rampant inequality, whatever sense of the word, we haven't even defined it yet. And we have climate change, we have all these problems, we need to imagine a new social form. What the apologists want to offer us is that reform, tinkering with statistical inequality and statistically identifiable aspects of inequality. We can tinker with those, we can make it, but we cannot imagine a new social form, again.
But there's nothing here that helped me imagine
easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
But there's literally nothing in the introduction or anything that helps me understand a different social form that could actually solve these complex issues. Or even what a new social form would be. Like literally, I mean, maybe that's what I was kind of asking at the beginning. It's like maybe it comes later in the book, but there's literally nothing in here that helps with that.
Well, we did only read the first 3. It might come up in the conclusion, but as it stands, the Davids are going to lose every game of Age of Empires they ever played.
Yeah.
You can't win without a siege workshop.
By the way, I'm not comfortable ascribing to at least Fukuyama because I actually read a lot of that book. My memory is he actually critiques both Hobbes and Rousseau and thinks they're both wrong about the origins of human. If my memory is, he thinks that the state of nature would have actually been a lot of reciprocal kind of communal societies, and that no one would have been isolated, right? Both Hobbes and Rousseau have this weird individualist perspective of the state of nature. But setting that aside, I am just interested in why you think this actually helps us imagine something different.
Because, and this is what I've been sort of saying in a different version earlier, because it breaks us out of the mindset that this is natural or inevitable, or, the old political economy view of the market, right? It is the natural outcome of human social organization. If there are many takeaways.
I don't think that we're stuck in a situation thinking that nothing can change because we read too much Rousseau and Hobbes. There's a lot more facts.
Yeah.
Well, not because we read too much Rousseau and Hobbes, right? It's because of this flattening out and literalizing of their narratives, right?
It's not an ideas thing. It's an organization thing. So Victor's asking, how do you change the organization by knowing this now?
Well, then, okay, I don't know. Look out for next year's Nobel Prize, because whoever offers that is going to win fucking all of them.
No, but my question is, but is there a model in the archaeological evidence that helps? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
No, I would say no, there is not.
It's one of those, it could have been otherwise, thus it can be otherwise books. And I don't want to fall back simply to the lazy critique of, well, what do we do with this? Tell me what to do, David Dads. But I don't know. It's still legit. I'm getting tired of, if we just had more ideas, then the world wouldn't have looked like this. Ideas don't matter. Because none of this was, anyway, an argumentative or rational process. But speaking of inevitability, I wanted to make sure we got this in there. They do take a shiv to Homo economicus, which I was happy to read because capitalist apologists do this in every argument whether they have some idea what they're talking about or none, is that humans naturally form markets. And even more than that, sometimes the market is an eternal form and the ultimate governing form of human behavior, all the way back to the Stone Age, when they were trading leather for fish or whatever. I've heard this like repeated over and over again. And then one of their examples is people will point to evidence like, oh, look, there's shells from Mexico in Ohio. So these bands must have been using these shells as currency. And they say, well, first of all, we have 3 different options that are not market-based for this. And I found this pretty fascinating. Like, for example, people took dreams very seriously. So if you would dream of having an object or having a dog, you would go on a vision quest to go find the object that you dreamed of or a dog. So some sort of exchange happened this way. But the funnier one, this is a direct quote, hilarious sentence. Women in indigenous North American societies were inveterate gamblers.
Oh, yeah.
So they aren't gambling for money, but they're gambling for jewelry and shit, you know? Women be accessorizing since 10,000 BC.
Exactly.
Oh, God. I mean,
but then they would basically have games nights where you'd meet with like the next village over, girls' night, games night. You know, they don't change. There's a human
Gender
universal where they
essentialism.
go and gamble. Yeah, exactly. They go gamble for jewelry. So this is how an alternate story of how shells got from Mexico to Ohio, or amber is another one they talk about. So, you know, the easy picture is to say, oh, they're using rare items. This is exchange. They're trying to create a market, and they, perhaps not totally convincingly, but they say there's totally other explanations for how these objects or metals got from one place to another.
Yeah, I mean,
they don't say that there was no market because I don't think you could prove that.
Well, I think if you follow the Marxist argument about what a capitalist society looks like, then you have that sort of impersonal form of rulership, and you have a labor market and all that stuff. So, like, clearly that's not developed earlier on, right? It's like the same thing, you know, Marx is wrong because, well, they had money in ancient Greece. Well, money was not the fucking same thing in ancient Greece as it was today, was it? The markets were not the same thing. They were not like the drivers of all social change.
Yeah, this made me think of Baudrillard's critique of Marx, actually, because he wants to reintroduce this notion of symbolic value, where things are not tied to production and consumption as much as they are tied to gift giving. Or you could, in this case,
like compacts and obligations kind of between people.
Yeah, or sacrifice, or these things that don't fit into simply the logic of exchange and use.
Like death-related rituals and things, which we tend to get out of sight now. We don't like death. We don't like any of that, but what to do with your dead people was obviously an enormously important thing.
And not a very productive thing either.
Yeah, but Baudrillard's right to see that as a kind of underside of the, not the symbolic, but the sort of sign regime.
What we are left with, though, is an alternative story that just says this is more complicated. It's written for a public audience, I think.
Which
probably.
I'm cool with, that story. Yeah.
Which is a good story to read. But then you inevitably, at the end of the episode, you kind of get to, well, what do we do with this? What is the point of this?
I mean, I want to actually keep reading the book because I think, like, I'm interested just from pure kind of like normal curiosity about history and archaeological evidence. Like, I'm curious if they come up, because my understanding was they do talk about examples of societies that are more complicated because, okay, like setting aside the capitalism question, like my understanding was that, you know, that there's this word, there's this idea, and they even mentioned it at the beginning in the introduction, right? That, oh, like, you know, you either have like egalitarianism at a really small scale, or once you get to a bigger scale, like there's this problem of scale that they seem to want to attack. And I'm really curious if they have examples of large scale civilizations that are very egalitarian. And my understanding was that maybe there were some examples of that later in the book, because that is something that I will say, like, however we're defining Rousseauian versus Hobbesian, whatever. But I do think that I do find the problem of scale to be a serious problem, a scale and complexity, where I don't really see how you could have no hierarchy, but like a really large, complicated scale. I don't know. I can't imagine it. And maybe that's my lack of imagination, but.
Their argument is, oh my God, for that, it's Mexico.
It's not the Aztecs though, is it? Because they were not egalitarian.
They're the ones that built the temples, like the Temple of the Sun, the Temple of the Moon, the Temple of the Snake. It's near Mexico, and they apparently what they did. Again, this is like another going back and forth. In the beginning, they built these big ass fucking temples, and they found like ritual killing burials in the bottoms of the temples. And apparently around 3rd, 4th century AD, they just closed the temples and they redirected funds from building monumental architecture like that to social, and they became much more egalitarian.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt, but the idea here is that they to build these grand, there was some form of hierarchy with religion, with some priestly class, which is presumed to be a more advanced form, but they shut it all down. So they deduce that, something wasn't working. So in the linear narrative, they would have reverted to a less advanced form. But what the Davids are saying is that this was a variable, ongoing, negotiable process, not a linear progression from one stage to the next, age 1, age 2, age 3.
And that they have both social forms. So the money basically goes to where the biggest projects decided by the elites, it goes there. But then there's other city forms that have much less hierarchical, much more either temporary structures where they'll actually just break up and move out of the city, or they'll have a kind of egalitarian city where there's no rulership or a rotating rulership or something like that. Like shared office kind of stuff, like ancient Rome, collegiality.
But those are still considered like not a complex, large like society. You know what I mean? Like something with big infrastructure projects and large. I mean, because like if you want to have an answer to the question of how do we like deal with modern conditions and like you kind of need to have some story about complex infrastructure, complex social organizations that are bigger than a tribal level, right?
Well, then again, we should look at the the Mesoamerican. Yeah, that's perfect. That's a perfect question. And so we can look at, so in the context of hunter-gatherers, we look at Göbekli Tepe, like monumental architecture, right? So if you're thinking that during that time people lived in bands of 10 to 20 people, then it would be fucking impossible to understand how people built these places with 15-ton blocks, right? Same with, even with like they actually have a new story to tell about the Stonehenge too. But the point there is that there's a yearly roundabout where the part of the year where people, the hunt is good, the shit's on, right? So they're all gathering at this place, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. There's a bunch of other sort of satellite areas too. And they all come together in this community and then they split. But there's some evidence that some people live there all year round, but generally much lower population. And then suddenly at a certain time of the year, there's a big ass population. And then the point is, how did these places get built in the first place? Well, there must have been some kind of social organization that transcended the 10 to 20 people band family units, right? And so we say, okay, well then it can't just be the situation where there are just hunter-gatherers and they're completely distinct from city building and agriculture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've heard about Göbekli Tepe.
It's just problematizing. Yeah. It's one of the oldest sites of monumental architecture on the planet, and you have to think, well, how did it get built? It must have.
But isn't that more a question about, well, okay, there's obviously stuff that was more than hunter gatherers, but
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I don't know how that tells us
more.
anything about egalitarianism. Like, I don't know. Like, there's not reason to think that.
Well, that's not on the egalitarian question. That's on the question of hunter-gatherers not living in cities or in agriculture.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Fine.
Like,
yeah, that's fine.
if they had the capacity to do those things in what's Göbekli Tepe, like 8,000 BCE or something like that. If they had the capacity to do that, then there must have been like, it can't just be that fucking story of egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands. That's the point.
Yeah. They also make an aesthetic case here saying, like, it's just way more interesting to be in Indigenous life compared to Western life. They straight up say that.
That's a nice, that's exactly how to get on Pills's good side. Tell him something's more interesting.
Yeah, exactly. This is one gets the sense that Indigenous life was just a lot more interesting than in a Western town or city. Especially, by the way, Rousseau could have written this. Yeah. Especially insofar as the latter involved, or the Western town or city involves monotonous, repetitive, conceptually empty activity. The fact is that we find it hard to imagine how such an alternative life could be endlessly engaging and interesting is perhaps more a reflection on the limits of our imagination than on the life itself. Rousseau was talking about the division of labor, right? And saying doing one thing sucks.
Yeah.
This is why we have Montessori schools based on Émile's education, because Émile's education, division of labor is more efficient. Not a single person will argue against that. But it's also soul draining. So you should be good at a whole bunch of things, which is why, despite being more efficient, the division of labor is a negative thing.
Yes.
And that's not something, unfortunately, that we can just rewind the clock on. It's impossible, except for maybe, I don't know, giving people more guaranteed vacation time or I don't know what the solution there is, except for something that is self-help. It's like, if you're depressed and sad and your life's monotonous, go get good at stuff. Rousseau said that, though. We don't necessarily need the entire reconstruction of Indigenous societies from archaeological evidence to tell us that.
Yeah.
I
reminds me of they quote Benjamin Franklin too. And he talks about this phenomenon of Indian children being abducted, but them wanting to go back and live at home again eventually. Like, they can't be fully socialized, quote unquote, whatever. But then he says, once I remember to have heard where the person was brought home to possess a good estate, but finding some care necessary to keep it together, relinquished it to a younger brother, reserving to himself nothing but a gun and a match coat, with which he took his way again to the wilderness.
There's no conception that, living without plumbing could actually be better.
Well, like, what do you say to a history where, like, okay, Europeans come over, they colonize the Americas, and then there's this sort of amazing cultural discourse between the peoples that has nearly ceased today, because we really need to start recognizing the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples in the 21st goddamn century. But back then, okay, there's this huge exchange, and the critiques of civilization are put in the mouths of the Indigenous and the so-called noble savages and exotics. But one of the critiques was that, like, they're shocked by all the homelessness in European cities, and like, they don't have homelessness. I mean, I just cannot imagine that. You hear about in East Berlin or something before the wall comes down, there's no homelessness in communist countries, because if you don't have a job, you get assigned one. That could not be the case without that kind of bureaucracy.
There's
So what's this other critique about homelessness? You're not being assigned a job? What the fuck does that mean? I don't understand.
Did the Indigenous critique just break your imagination because you can't imagine not having to work all day to have somewhere to live?
But it's amazing. It's so interesting that they saw these cities, they saw the homelessness, and that becomes a critique of European ideas. I don't know. These sorts of ideas just seem to be like Europe internalized them, and now we have these sort of social democratic versus neoliberal discourses where whether or not there should be homeless people and whether it's inevitable. But these have their origins again in this Enlightenment period of the exchanges with the North Americans, and especially this Condillac dude who seems like a fucking badass.
Yeah, the Condillac stuff was interesting. Yeah, we can't really get into that now, but maybe I think we should do another episode on it. I think we should keep reading.
Yeah, I'm down. Or maybe.
But yeah, let's do good episode. Enjoyed the book. Would recommend, or learn a lot from it. And maybe we'll see. I mean, I look forward to seeing the next chapters to see if maybe I get a bit more of an answer to my central question.
Yeah, it might unstick us from our old views, but it won't tell us anything to do.
And if you do read it, remember, this is Rousseauian, despite the fact that they just lambasted him.
I know. Yeah, they were a bit harsh. I mean, later they do say some stuff about how he was probably the founder of left-wing thought, but they don't even actually say it in like a nice way necessarily.
Yeah, they kind of just say Hobbes is right-wing and leftists prefer Rousseau.
Yeah. I don't even know how you define freedom as a value or like the value of humanity without Rousseau. Anyway.
We'll get to that.
They have their anarchist way of doing that, which there's 3 of them, which we can look at next week.
Thanks, everybody. We will talk at you.
Thank you very much.
Later.
Wait, I have a new topic I want to dive into. No, I'm just kidding.
No, thanks.
Bye.
No. I mean, you wish.